Carter is a founding partner of GRA. He's Australia's premier supply chain consulting firm. It specialises in supply chain strategy, planning and execution. Over its 23-year history, GRA has helped 200 plus organisations across multiple industries identified combined savings of more than $10 billion. GRA is focused on practical results delivery, and its mission is to turn its clients' supply chains into a competitive advantage. Carter has over 20 years of international supply chain advisory and transformation experience and taught at the master's level within Monash University's Logistics and Supply Chain Management program. With a series of published articles and white papers, press quotes and frequent speaking engagements, Carter is a recognised expert in his field. And Carter's going to be talking about From Offshore Supply to the Last Mile Fulfilment, upgrading end-to-end supply chain strategy and design. Welcome, Carter.
So we just heard a presentation about American supply chains from an Australian. You're now going to hear a presentation about Australian supply chains from an American. I enjoy how the topics of these presentations often link up quite well. So the last presentation finished on the idea of differentiated supply chains, and more or less that's what this presentation is about. Because over the last few years, as we've been doing supply chain strategy and network design, what we've realized is just becoming a little bit more intricate, a bit more complex, because there's a lot more options. So on one hand, that's exciting because there are options to differentiate and do other things. On the other hand, it can be overwhelming if we don't have the clarity or the operational capability to deliver against it. So, it's kind of a razor's edge time to be in supply chain, really exciting. And I guess another way of saying that is there's a real opportunity, probably more of an opportunity to get it right. But the other side of that is what? There's also an opportunity to kind of not get it so right. So we'll talk about some of the trends that are creating that context, and then some ways that some of those challenges are being addressed successfully. So I'd like to just cover a couple high-level trends, though, before we move into the specifics of supply chain. The first one is a graph showing population growth. So I stumbled across this in a National Geographic a few years ago and sort of went, ooh. And way down here on the left-hand corner, it shows the world population, AD1 at about 200 million. So about the height of the Roman Empire, about 200 million people. Roll forward to 1800, it's at about 1 billion people. So think about the industrial and medical improvements that were starting to be made around that time, industrial improvements. But then the next thing to look at, it's interesting, is then between 1800 and 1930, it goes to 2 billion. Oh, so what took nearly 2,000 years to increase by a factor of 5, the same step change happened in about 100 years. And then it's effectively doubled about every 40 to 50 years since then. So there's some people alive that have seen the population increase by a factor of 4 in their lifetimes, which is unprecedented. So there's a lot of us kicking around. It's meant to plane off about 2045 at around 9 billion. That's what the estimates say. But have a think about rates of consumption as well, product life cycles. So there's a lot of us doing lots of stuff and doing it really fast. And again, the flip side to this is also, I just like to bring in the idea of some social responsibility around this as well, because this stuff's exciting. I'm not convinced it's all great. Other thing is when I see a chart like this that shoots up rapidly, where does it end up going? In a lot of cases, the other way. So I think it's exciting on one hand. On the other hand, I think there's a need to look at this a little bit more closely. And how do you feel when you see that graph? Another interesting fact that I heard once was that most living systems, to acquire a calorie of energy for sustainment, expend just under a calorie of energy. Human beings expend 10 to 1. So in terms of the energy usage, it would be seen to be unsustainable, and one of the reasons for that is we've figured out a way of converting hundreds of millions of years of stored solar power in the form of petroleum into immediate energy. So that's what we're up to. Just from some more cheery information, a good friend of mine is in one of the big corporate recovery firms, and he said he's been pretty slow the last few years. But he said he's going to get he expects to get really busy in about 18 months. I said, why? He said, well, we had the global liquidity crisis. So he said we solved it by increasing global liquidity by a factor of 3. And all the asset prices has gone up accordingly. So his view, and quite a well-founded view or well-experienced view, is that in sort of 18 to 24 months, we might be headed back to something that's a little bit more challenging in terms of the global economy. So it's just worth keeping that in mind. I'm certainly looking at that in terms of our business because we've got a lot on at the moment. But we've got this dance about should we bring on and invest right now? Because we're really not sure. Because we've had a pretty good run for 5 or 6 years. Is what happens. And then usually there's a little bit of a change. And the supply chains need to be resilient and adaptive around that as well. So one is the increased populations. That's one point to note. The second one is the data trail that we're leaving, the use of online browsing, mobile devices, having our location turned on in Google. So there's an enormous data footprint that's being created, and interestingly, it's getting more and more granular. So right down to the point of kind of seeing when people are making independent decisions, and I guess the predictive capabilities in this are really interesting. So this was also out of National Geographic. I actually had the hard copy magazine, which shows how long ago this was. It was like 3 years ago, way back when. And this was the front cover of an article about MIT labs, and the little call-out bubbles are predictions they can make with a high degree of confidence, very high degree of confidence, without knowing anything about the person. So these were things like likelihood of repaying a bank loan. So interesting to know. The other question is, but depending on who knows that and how it's used, what might happen? Yeah. I thought one of the ones that was in some ways one of the most shocking to me when I first read it was pregnant but doesn't know it yet. So again, there'll be biochemical changes, which leads to neurochemical changes, which leads to different behaviors, which can be picked up by search engines, and a prediction made about a person being pregnant before that person actually knows. It's cool, it kind of creeps me out at the same time. But the bottom line on all this is that it means that with that amount of data, it is, and that's the point, it's data. So to me, data, it's just bunches of bits of, look, it's this, it's that, it's that. I don't necessarily know what to do with it until I process it and turn data into information that supports decision making. So the opportunity is to kind of, boil the data into some information that allows me to make decisions in the supply chain. There's a lot of predictive analytic type applications that will help in this respect. And you may or may not have heard of Amazon's push to do predictive replenishment based on previous order profiles and so on. So there are applications of this starting to emerge, and some have been in place for a while. So on one hand, we've got lots of us running around. On the other hand, we got lots of us generating lots of data. And the third point is that supply chains are getting a little bit more complex. So they're longer. So particularly in Australia, we've been expanding out generally to import, to lower cost economies, and we'll talk about procurement and supply chain strategy in a minute and how that links. So there's a lot of businesses have gone offshore, so there's a longer supply chain. But then on the other side, we've got many more customer channels. So there's a much higher degree of service expectation and delivery. So it's kind of stretched out a bit. In the middle of that, there's increased complexity around new sourcing, fulfillment, and customer channels. So lots of different ways we can get the stuff in. So, do we get it from overseas? And if we get it from overseas, do we get it through a consolidation center over there? Do we have it packed there and then bring it into a crawl stock here? So lots of options around flow paths. There's also lots around, again, the fulfillment methodologies and also the customer channels. So as I said, here we are, there's more of us, more data, and there's more options on the supply side and more options on the customer side. And also there's more fragmentation, so broader product offers, shorter product life cycles, and again, these higher expectations. So what we're really seeing is the idea of the one-size-fits-all supply chain, which in my opinion was always kind of an idea, but roll it back 20 years ago, there were kind of more quote-unquote standard supply chain models that got applied. What we're seeing now generally is that there's almost multiple supply chains in any given business. And the thing is that you really need to tailor it, and it needs to be tailored based on what the customer expects, what the product profile is, and what the sourcing channel looks like. All that then calls into question the need, or calls into account the need for more clarity and integration in the supply chain. So this is here's one we developed earlier. So this is just a model we use to kind of look at a supply chain from top to bottom. So on the top box, it says business strategy. So key question is what are we on about? What are we trying to do? Because, and once we have a clear picture of that, then the question is, what's the customer value proposition? And then we start working out what the supply chain strategy is, and then we work out what the network looks like, and so on and so forth. Interestingly, one of the things that I see not so well defined in a lot of cases is the customer value proposition. We need to service the customer at a very high level, so how do you define that? Sometimes that can be a little loose. That's okay. It's just that that can come at quite a high cost because it creates a lot of reactivity and lack of clarity about what's important when we have shortages, how do we make trade-off decisions, and so on. The other part of this I'd sort of refer to, it says KPIs, policies and incentives is a common statement I hear from the C-suite is we don't understand why the people making the decisions are making those decisions, and then the people making the decisions say we don't really know what the people sitting up there expect us to do. So again, there's often a lack of clarity in what we call that policy layer. Is what are the delegations? What decisions can and can't I make? Where do that has to and they don't have to be like ironclad giant things, but just clarity around what's the focus and priority, and how do we make those decisions? And it takes a lot of the frustration and second guessing out, if that's a bit clear. And then sort of what sits, so the kind of the three broad chunks of this is that whole top layer is really what we call more the strategy, the direction, that middle layer is the integration, and the bottom layer is really all the capabilities, so people, processes, and systems, and the data. And again, we have to be clear about what we're trying to do up there to make sure we design something that delivers. If we now break that down into some of the trends that I mentioned before, one is the increased sourcing complexity. So again, we've talked about increased product proliferation, longer lead times, greater fragmentation of suppliers, and more degrees of freedom within those decisions about how I allocate once the supply is coming my way. What do I do there? And at the same time, we're expected to have more visibility and predictability around that as well. And what we're also seeing with some of the sort of leaders in this space do is start to really come, and I think this is becoming more and more evident, and I think you mentioned it in your presentation as well before, is that at one point in time, the idea of network design and inventory was kind of a one, then a two. We'll work out the network, then we'll work out inventory. Now it's much more of an iterative process, and in our judgment, it needs to be because they affect one another. Very similar to procurement and supply chain in that procurement, at a very, very, very high level, and apologies if I offend anyone by simplifying this too much, but the aim of procurement traditionally has been how do I get the best gross margin? So lowest price, where supply chain is actually looking at net margin. So it's really the cost to serve. So there have been examples of businesses, and you may have seen it in some of your businesses, where a decision was made around a low-cost supplier that had a higher ultimate net cost. Once we started looking at things like, well, every now and then we have to air freight something because we run out, and that just blew away all the savings. Or we've got quality issues, or whatever. Certainly have seen that. So what we're now seeing, though, is a more of an integrated view that says, when we're looking at a supply base, maybe it's not just the lowest cost supplier, and maybe it's just not the lowest cost and volume. Maybe it's volume by geography. Because what we need to make sure is that, we've got a consolidation of suppliers by a certain port that allows us to consolidate. So each individual supplier might not be the lowest cost, but as the total cost picture, it is. And we can get some centralization and some visibility and so on through that locale. And I think that's what it says on the next slide. So as we've said, the lead times have increased, and offshore warehousing consolidation is becoming increasingly common, and we're seeing that typically done through partnerships in offshore economies. And from a consolidation perspective, seeing a lot of direct-to-store pallet container prep, value-add processes might be picking and packing at origin, labeling, slip sheeting, and so on. And the general idea is to have those labor costs incurred somewhere else, in a lower cost profile. And again, trying to be cognizant of being proximal to the supply base. To give you an example of this, so this was this is an anonymous example, but one that was real for a business we worked with. And it was very much around this, which was there was a push to do more importing to increase the gross profit. On the other hand, there was a recognition that that could actually increase supply chain costs, so how do we balance that? And broadly, there ended up being 4 different kind of supply to customer channels or processes that were put in place. So model 1 is store-ready pallets. So we've got the supplier at the top, the pallets are prepared there, there's a consolidation point, in this case probably offshore, and then that comes in, the containers are unloaded and it goes directly to the store. So that's one model, and on a sort of a dollar for dollar basis, well, I'll do the comparison in a second, but what we found was that had a lower cost, but it's higher risk from an inventory perspective. Because think about it, if that's 14 weeks away, I'm having to make my inventory decisions 14 weeks in advance, which means I got to be a lot better at forecasting. And if I'm going direct to a store as opposed to like a DC, then I've got to hold the safety stock in every store. Make sense? In other words, the stores are covering the risk, so there is an inventory trade-off, and again, this is often not what's looked at. But generally speaking, this is a lower cost, higher risk type approach, and it tends to work for, say, promo type items, seasonal items. And again, I don't like using generalizations because every time I say that, there's always an example where that's not true, but in general, that's kind of where it tends to work. The second model was more of a cross-dock. So it's shipped from the supplier, but then the allocation occurs when the product's on the water. So it's coming through, it's not there yet. So there's an allocation decision made a bit closer to the point of sale. So again, we're not having to forecast as far in advance, and then when it arrives in Australia, it goes to a cross-dock and then gets shipped out to the stores. And this is more, you call this like a medium risk, medium cost sort of option, as is the second one, the flow-through, where again, we're deferring that allocation decision even closer to the point. Again, if demand's quite variable, this might make sense. It hits, and boom, we're trying to get it out, and it goes flow through to the stores. And then the last model is kind of what might be seen as more of the traditional model. We order the product and hold it in a DC. And again, you all will likely have seen examples of this or dealt with this in your own businesses. But that model 4, put away, that might work really well for items that are bought in bulk, low cost, low demand variability. You hold the, or they can be high value items where I'm actually trying to hold the inventory centrally and minimize the amount of stock holding across the network. So I have less in the store and just kind of drip it out. And that one, again, has a higher quote unquote logistics cost, much lower risk because we're actually kind of got the buffer stock locally. But then there's an inventory cost element that needs to be put into this as well. And this is kind of what I said before about the need to make network decisions, inventory decisions, and customer decisions all at once. It's because all of these things are true. And I've seen some decisions made where some of these things were left out. So, the assumptions were made that this will happen, but the analysis wasn't done, and it can cost. So that's really on the inbound side in terms of some of the things that we're seeing that are creating the need to look at this a bit more closely and get the options right. The next one is around what's actually happening with distribution centers themselves. So this is now in the distribution center. So they've improved a lot through the technology that's been put in since the 90s, warehouse management systems, some automation and so on. And that's allowed these businesses to increase in scale without necessarily having a linear cost increase. So that's been great, and that's helped. I think what's next for DCs, though, is what we're really saying is if automation becomes more and more the driver of cost, automation solutions tend to be well matched to specific product profiles and ordering patterns. So it's now really more, it's not so much volume by facility, but it's almost like volume by product profile. How does it get ordered? What are its dimensions? Because the way I'm going to handle, tiny, little cube boxes of cute squishy toys and kayaks, there may be a difference. So these are the Kiva robots. This is an Alibaba warehouse. And that's what's called a goods to person system. Really great for each Pix online fulfillment. Brings the product to the person. Not so great at using the height of the facility, notice that? So again, what we just saw is an example of something that's really great for each PICS, but doesn't really use the cube of the facility, where if you go back to more of a conveyor type system or carousel type system, maybe not as applicable for each PICS, but again, better utilization, and it is horses for courses, so it depends on what the product profile is and the cost associated with that. What we're also seeing in Australia is, oh, it was so good, let's watch that again. One observation about Australia is that, again, and you'd be aware of this, which is the relative size of Australia relative to the US, and then the population numbers, and then the distribution. And I guess one of the things that I see in Australia is that, we still do have a lot of options, and like sort of a tenth of the population. And to your point as well, we've done a couple of global study tours going around and looking at various businesses and this sort of technology. And the general thing we've heard is that not many businesses are really making a whole lot of money out of this, but they felt it was a ticket to play. They kind of had to. And the idea is once the industry consolidates and gets to a bigger point, there'll be some winners in that. And of course, there's all the information about how heavily Amazon has been funded to try to achieve that economy of scale. But the point we're making here is that in Australia, it does seem to be challenging for a lot of businesses to be able to make a case for investing in this kind of technology by themselves. So we're now seeing some of the 3PLs offer more product-style solutions. So like this is the Toll 3PL facility in Western Sydney. And a prediction, don't know if it'll come true, but a prediction is possibly that the 3PLs will become more product-centric than customer-centric. So the old model of 3PL was, we'll take all of your business. It may start moving into, we'll take the parts of it we're really good at and try to get the aggregation and economies of scale that way. So the next one is the evolution of the distribution footprint itself. So we've talked about, the options of stuff coming in, procurement, supply chain strategy, flow paths. We've talked a little bit about how distribution centers themselves are changing. And the next one now is really, so how do we see that footprint evolving? And again, there are more considerations now because of the different inbound channels and outbound channels and customer dynamics. And there's a question around fulfillment too, and this is why customer service promise makes such a big difference, because if I have a service promise that says you can place an order, so we've got 100,000, so I'm using a particular example in my mind, which I won't name, but we've got 150 stores, 100,000 products in each store, and we've got 300,000 in the online offering. And we want to be able to, reach 95% of Australia within a certain period of time. So if my offer is I place an order, and let me be clear, I don't carry that full 300,000 SKU range in every store, about a third of it, but I can place an online order for any of those SKUs. Well, if my offer is that you get a single order and one delivery at one cost, then my inventory strategy, network strategy is going to have to change. Relative to, I'm happy to give you 2 orders. One will come quick, one will come a little bit later, and we may or may not charge you twice, depends. So this is where the discussion with the marketing team becomes really important, like, that's a great offer, and this is what that might cost, so are there some other options, and it becomes a much more collaborative discussion. And just an example of some of the new solutions that, and when I say new, they've been around for a few years, but this just gives you an example of some of the creative thinking. Something called a dark store, usually located in high-density areas, really good for online fulfillment. They're basically set up like a store, but oftentimes with automation, because the standard distribution center isn't really set up for each PICS. So this is an idea of how do we get something close to the customer that has a very strong setup to support online fulfillment. As it says, 3 times more efficient than traditional supermarkets in filling online orders. And there's a cost trade-off there too, though, because the real estate is going to be more expensive closer in. So we're seeing kind of these blended models starting to emerge. Things that used to be, it was either this or this. There are kind of some mixed solutions. And for each one of these examples I can give you, there's another couple. So again, it's an exciting time, and there are more options on what that distribution network structure might look like to meet the customer needs. Okay. And again, I've just talked about this before, but what's becoming increasingly apparent is this idea of, it's kind of a mixture of availability and responsiveness. What do I have available to the customer, and how responsive am I going to be to them? Those 2 decisions will then lead to what does my network need to look like, and where am I stocking my inventory? And those two things are a matched pair. And so we can't really do that in isolation. Well, we can do it in isolation, it's just we don't advise it. It's like swimming outside the flags. And the last one is reinventing the last mile. And I'll just start here by, with the picture of Happy Jeff. Here he is, hey! The idea that this last mile piece, there's so much happening in here, and I'll give you a couple of examples, but it is really, it's a really kind of rich, fertile opportunity for innovation. And I don't know what the answers to any of this is just yet, and I don't think anybody does. There's lots of things being trialed and tested, and again, it depends what you do. So it's, as it says, fragmentation, it's prompting a required step change in the way we do delivery. Strategic partnerships are becoming really important for offering this kind of convenience. Last mile delivery is really presenting an opportunity in customer experience, and I'll show you a little video on that as well. And there's a whole bunch, there's a whole bunch that's coming. It is day one. And his quote was quite funny. His customers are always beautifully, wonderfully dissatisfied, even when they report being happy and business is great. Kind of a benefit of being in the Western world, right?
Zero is the first online marketplace in Switzerland. What we see is that new delivery services are demanded by the customer. You must be able to deliver a product when the customer is requesting it. Once the customer ordered, the parcel got packed at the merchant, and then it's mounted below the drone. The drone will fly autonomously to the landing positions and hand the product over to the van. And then the last mile transportation is done by the van.
The logistics challenges arise in that last mile delivery when vehicles get caught up in city traffic. And this is what causes delays, unreliability, and of course costs. And these are the types of challenges that we believe that we can solve by combining the Mercedes-Benz vans together with the Matternet drone.
Volvo in-car delivery is a service which, via a digital key, allows consumers to take delivery of goods direct to their cars. Once the delivery is complete, the owner is alerted via an SMS or email. The digital key then ceases to exist.
I just was thinking, if someone told me when I was like 8 years old, I'd be on stage one day watching a picture of someone put groceries in somebody's car and talking excitedly about it, I might have made some different decisions. All good. Okay, so I wanted to offer that as a way of just framing this next piece, which is, I think there's a big shift happening in supply chains and customer convenience as well, which is, the way it sort of used to work was, it's kind of like, well, how do I need to fit my day into the supply chain? Where it's kind of going now is, how does the supply chain fit my day? And those are some examples there. So the question is, if I have an online order and I want to deliver it, is the offer same day, next day, 3 to 5 business days? And how am I going to do that profitably? And the next one is click and collect. So do I do that store pickup, partner store pickup, and convenience channels? And just to kind of give an overlay of some of the opportunity around that, is that in terms of the number of places I can get a morning coffee, there's 22,000 locations. There's 6,700 petrol stations. Then I go to the grocery store, there's 3,000 locations there. Maybe I go to the train, 800 locations there, school drop-off, 9,400 locations, and so on. So there is a lot of infrastructure kind of out there, and the question is, what opportunities are there around partnerships and networks that could be created to offer something novel, and not having to invest myself. And then this last piece is around customer experience. I think this is a really interesting model, what this business does. And so I'll just again show you the video and then talk about that quickly.
There's an entirely new way to buy the world's best tech products. It's called Enjoy.
When you buy from Enjoy, the world's coolest tech products come to you.
You don't have to wait for those crazy lines at the stores, and you don't have to wait for a delivery man.
First, you get fast and free hand delivery, wherever and whenever you like. You can get it as soon as 4 hours. And your product isn't dropped off by a delivery man.
It's hand delivered to you by an Enjoy expert, like me.
Like me.
Like me.
but we're specifically trained in all the new gear. We'll spend an hour with you and teach you everything you need to know about your product.
So instead of fumbling with the manual,
We'll connect all of your devices.
You'll be shooting your next GoPro movie.
Or jam it out to your new Sonos.
or flying your new drone, all within an hour.
We call this an enjoy visit.
But you might just call it amazing.
And the most amazing part of it all of this, fast delivery and expert help,
It's all free.
So why wouldn't you buy from Enjoy?
So interesting, huh? So one of the points I'd make about this organization is they tend to work with a very specific product set. So this probably doesn't work if you're buying corn chips or toothbrushes. But if you're, drones, technology products, and I think they've now moved into some more high-value kind of luxury items as well. So it's high-margin products, highly specialized. They're pretty targeted in what they're doing, so their margins can kind of absorb it. But what else have they done? They've taken the store out. I mean, they basically just removed an entire layer of the supply chain. So it's kind of an older example, but it's what IKEA did, some time ago, which is said, we'll bring furniture in, but the store is the warehouse, it's flat packed. So, we don't ship all the air across, and then I'm the product picker and assembler, and not a particularly good assembler. So usually I don't call on someone and go, I don't understand the instructions, help me. But it's a similar idea. It's kind of really looking at the supply chain, saying, well, what does the customer really value, and is there an opportunity to compress something and take out a whole layer of cost? So I think it's a pretty exciting example as well. So in summary, I think it's an exciting time to be in supply chain. There's the population and data explosion on an exponential scale. Supply chains are longer, more complex, and more fragmented, again, which creates more options. Also means that the need to integrate the business strategy and the customer offer, again, it comes back to that customer offer point, to then make sure the supply chain is aligned to it is really, really key. So some tighter integration there. There's a real opportunity to get that right and make that a source of competitive advantage, and it's also a great time for some creative thinking. Thanks very much.